Yeah, thanks, Josh. My name is Michael Connor. I'm from Rhizome.org. We are a digital art nonprofit that was founded in New York in 1996, which makes this our 30th anniversary year. It's really fun to be partnering with Josh and Artwrld on this series of the Artwrld podcasts. This is the second of our 12 episodes, and we're here with leading super spreader of the male handsomeness epidemic, Josh Citarella, a photographer first associated with the post-internet moment of the 2010s, a cohort of artists who were tracking the ways that internet platforms were altering the circulation and meaning of images. In Josh's case, theorizing the photographic image in the age of the internet was of particular concern. In the wake of the 2016 elections, Josh began investigating ways that Gen Z were using social media, and in particular, Instagram. In 2018, he first published his research on the topic, Politigram the Post-Left, initially a short-run artist book with 55 copies that he later dropped as a PDF. The PDF went online like a bomb going off for a certain community of online thinkers, artists, and commentators, myself among them. Cedarella was opening a window to a generational shift in how people were navigating social media usage and political affiliation. In the wake of the PDF, Rhizome commissioned Citarella to continue this research throughout 2019 with the support of Stolben Institute. This commissioned research often took the form of late-night group conversations at Forlini's restaurant over carafes of red wine and plates of red sauce pasta, as we attempted to hold together an increasingly fractious political and philosophical conversation about truth and survival. In 2020, this all fell apart, not only because of a seismic shift that would forever change New York's social and cultural landscape. That's right, the closure of Forlini's. Josh formed a new online community, Do Not Research, a kind of alternative online school and meeting place for emerging artists and internet kids. This continued to grow and thrive, as has Josh, whose recent efforts include a wildly successful online podcast called Doomscroll and an exercise program. He's here today to tell us about his new research, which focuses on a multipolar art world. And I will leave it to him to tell you about that. Joshua.
Wow, Michael, thank you so much. That was just this incredibly generous introduction. And you know what? You stole all the best lines. So now I'm really gonna have to think on my feet here. Forgive me as I set up my screen here for a moment. Does that look good to everybody? You can see a slide of me as an anarcho-capitalist sitting in my micro apartment in Chinatown. Okay, great. I'm Joshua Citarella. I'm an artist and internet culture writer. Thank you to Josh for hosting me. Thank you, Michael, for the very generous introduction. And of course, to Rhizome. I was talking before we started the Zoom session, that the conversations we had during a series of programming that Rhizome put on, I guess this must have started in 2018, called InfoWars, that set of conversations maps so clearly to today's political constellation of different forces and factions in a way where the proper sphere of expert commentary just seems to not be grasping what is going on. So I'm going to do a very brief recap of some of that earlier work, and I'm today going to share a text that I wrote thinking through some of these new ideas. And yeah, fair warning, I'm going to speak in broad, sweeping generalizations. It's going to be an absolute catastrophe, but hopefully through that, we can kind of get at this core underlying idea. So for the past few years, many of you will be familiar with my work from my podcasts, from my newsletters. I have departed from the institutional context of the art world. I used to do a Twitch stream every Monday previous to Doomscroll, and I think the combined hours was somewhere around 700 or 800 by the end of it. What that meant was looking at an enormous amount of primary sources from internet culture about emerging political factions. This is also the warning point at which the memes that I show today, I want to differentiate from the artworks that are in the slide deck. I'm showing you something from internet culture to reflect on that is an organic development from all of these agonistic forces, but it is not an artwork that I myself have authorship over. We're kind of reflecting on this cultural development. While Aria Dean was the assistant curator at Rhizome, we had this series called under the broad umbrella of programming called InfoWars, which consisted of a panel discussion, some internal panel discussions, which I think were some of the best conversations that many of us in the art world had. Some of those people went on to be Verso authors, other ones got investment from venture capitalists to found new network states. They really scattered as far and wide to the wind as you could imagine. But at one point in time, they were all gathered around this core set of ideas of how is this global political economic order being reorganized, and doing a really granular examination of internet culture. We came up with this term weak signals at that time. And weak signals was something that, in the metaphor of different competing wavelengths and radio signals, is something that was hard to hear above the noise, but would soon become very strong and very influential. So think of it as early detection, a form of political trend casting, if you will. Rhizome was also the first institution to host me after I wrote Politigram and the Post-Left in 2018. We've had a long collaboration for many, many years. I feel very close to this institution. In particular, we did this book called 20 Interviews, which is exactly as it sounds. It is 10 young people from the left and 10 from the right that stamped, let's say the interviews are 2019 to 2020. You will find all of the familiar cast of character and political ideologies that are now in your news feed. So yeah, in many cases, in many unfortunate cases, actually, we were early on detecting some of these more recent trends. I'm also the host of a podcast named Doomscroll, which is now, I think, a year and 3 months, a year and 3 months into the program. So it's been a pretty ambitious, insane year to try and basically take these niche topics from the art world and then ask them to people who are, in some cases, very big participants in the media ecosystem or in the world of academia. It was a great privilege of my life to be able to ask Francis Fukuyama what he thought about internet memes about the end of history. The art world brings you to some very unusual places. But today I want to, as a jumping off point for this later article that I'll read and give some commentary, I was part of a panel discussion at Artist Space. This was organized around the Parrish Collection, a series of talks, the Seaport Talks, organized by critic Dean Kissick, that were a monthly program of 12 people meeting IRL, not recorded, these discussions about contemporary art. And in the course of this conversation, which I soon found myself to be playing the antagonist which is usually the other way around, where I am the institutionalist, and on this panel the roles were reversed. But someone from the audience volunteered the idea that contemporary art may be over in some important ways. And so I think what I'm kind of gesturing at in this upcoming text is that what we now refer to as modernism, which was, at the time, a phrase that sounded concurrent, and in the present, we now think of as a distinct historical period. And the topic of this panel discussion is that there were certain geopolitical factors, economic factors, political factors that were seemingly making a bookend on a certain period of political history, and that in some hindsight, we could potentially look at this category of contemporary art, its underlying philosophical assumptions, as being bookended roughly between the period of the 1970s and the 2020s. So, yeah, strap in. There's huge sweeping generalizations, but the world order as we have known it, in the world that we came up with, post Liberation Day, post Ground War in Europe, these things are just fundamentally different. So the very brief narrative, I think that we're taught to put together is that there's a kind of narrative through line that begins with the Salon des Refugiés up through modern art, contemporary art, and that this is a kind of trans-historical category of human endeavor. And I think that the general integrity of that category, the historical continuity of art, is becoming more difficult to maintain. The kind of icing on the cake of this entire problem is the internet itself, the mode of distribution today, where in this kind of previous analogy of individual artistic geniuses forking the decisions of conservative institutions, where you create the Impressionists have their own salon because they're excluded from, these kind of conservative, stodgy old structures. That today has basically been blown open because no one is excluded from the platform. And so this idea of individual and essentially kind of liberal philosophical position of this unique individual genius pushing history forward through these innovative ideas, that is becoming really, really difficult. And the kind of narrative through line that underpins contemporary art, I think, is in crisis as a result of it. So this now is forcing us to kind of re-narrativize what was the 1970s to the 2020s, the ascension of global liberalism during that period. Okay, so before I get too far ahead of myself, the title of this essay is A Multipolar Art World. And we're going to ask some big questions about this historical period, the underlying philosophical assumptions, and what was taken for granted in the post-1989 world after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the end of communism, and this assumption that liberal democracy was the kind of endpoint of human government. We seem to be at the end of globalization. With seismic political shifts, a certain era of contemporary art has also come to a close. In previous decades, contemporary art sought to unify a world society whose aesthetics, markets, and institutions would slowly converge upon a shared set of values. Soon, it may take on new purpose and vision. In this text, I will attempt to forecast what the world of contemporary art might look like beyond the 2020s and after the end of globalization. I will draw in particular upon a text with the artist Guido Sterl for Art in the Age of Average, the New AI Authoritarians, at the Academy of Art in Munich, as well as several other thinkers, the New Models podcast in particular, and also the Seaport Talks organized by Dean Kissick that I mentioned earlier. As an historical category, contemporary art begins in the mid-1970s with the emergence of new media art. In its broad philosophy, contemporary art follows the teleological arc of new communications technologies, steady progress towards an increasingly interconnected and open model of society. This historical period coincides with the political order of neoliberalism, similarly beginning in the 1970s and ending in the 2020s. The era is defined by these overlapping visions for a world society. There are many contradictions and points of alignment, emphasis on the word world. In hindsight, participation in the global system of contemporary art, as defined by its markets, institutions, and reputable publications, signaled a city or nation's arrival to the advanced world. During this period, a broad discursive network of biennials and museums of contemporary art cropped up in regions that had achieved a sufficient level of development and capital accumulation. Terms like biennialization became part of the common vernacular. So this is written very broadly here, but to give a few kind of firm examples of what I have in mind, I've had a few conversations with people after this text was published. In particular, I am thinking of the Marrakesh Biennial that began in 2004, the Gwangju Biennial in 1995. The two publications pictured here, Eflux, I think, is the kind of the forebearer in my experience of this, but then also Art Forum. Additionally, the Sharjah Biennial is not pictured here, but was formed in 1993. If you look at the origin or the kind of inaugural date of a lot of these biennials, there's a kind of steep arc in the 90s and early 2000s. So we start using terms like biennialization, how these cities and countries represent themselves to a more or less global society. And important to mention that in the curation of those biennials are many, many regional artists, but then there's always like a Lawrence Weiner or somebody in there. There's a canonized Western, usually American or European artist. And so they are, in my, under some criticism, Eurocentric view of this thing, they are kind of integrating themselves into a world society in that discursive network of contemporary art, but also as we explore into the financial networks as well. Oops, I'm one too far ahead. Forgive me. Continuing on with the text, participation in the networks of contemporary art also implicitly signaled a region's openness to international finance. In this environment, foreign investors could pursue their economic goals without fear of expropriation. While it's not written into the bylaws of any museum, no country with a respected biennial is going to nationalize its copper reserves. Now, friend of the show, Quinn Slobodian, gave me a whole bunch of shit about this at the after party for the TrueNon podcast because he was saying that Saudi Arabia has nationalized its oil, and so there's counterexamples of this. And I was like, thank you, Quinn. But what I meant through nationalized copper reserves was Salvador Allende, who's a democratic socialist in Chile. And that was the specific example I had in mind, that there was not going to be a prominent democratic socialist country that took part in the 90s biennialization to just be, sweeping generalizations. I'm trying to peg this to some more concrete examples. More questionably, the presence of contemporary art also implied a general trend towards liberalization in both politics and social values. During this period of globalization, and in particular from 1989 to 2024, contemporary art carried with it a deep-seated assumption towards the steady expansion of Western-style liberalism. While it was rarely stated outright, many of us thought that social change could begin at the arts institution and slowly diffuse throughout the rest of society. Art had a strong optimism about its potential to unify mankind. Viewed in this way, contemporary art served as a bellwether of neoliberal globalization. Now, rather than arriving at the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama suggested, we must speculate about what comes next. Exiting neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a political and philosophical project whose origins extend back to Europe in the 1940s. Since that time, neoliberals have envisioned a global and borderless society linked by free markets. Towards these global ends, neoliberals sought to erect an international legal framework that upheld individual private property rights above the sovereign authority of states. In the grand designs of these theorists, this slow extension of property rights was seen as a way to incrementally link a world society that guaranteed the free movement of capital. Today, shifts in economic policy and increased geopolitical tensions have fractioned these once planetary aspirations into distinct and separate blocks. So very, very briefly here, this is a historical citation from the Rampart Journal of Individualist Thought. This is published from the Mises Institute. It was on the archive of the Mises Institute. This is deep, deep back into that 1940s Mont Pelerin Society, the kind of initial think tank that founds neoliberal ideology. And what you see here is the same diagram that is on the cover of the book that we did with Rhizome back in 2020, is a rudimentary political compass with some minorly different language. But the degree to which this old school, like very old school, early 20th century liberal philosophy subtends all of our assumptions now, I think really can't be overemphasized. It is just tremendously mimetically powerful in a way that many of us have not been made consciously aware of. Continuing on here, while the legal notion of private property has penetrated deeply into most societies, the steady expansion of civil liberties or individual freedoms has been far less successful. We are now seeing a rejection of liberal universalisms and the emergence of alternative frameworks for what may constitute political rights. Similarly, we are seeing a divergence in hemispherical art markets. Chinese collectors are now purchasing less American art than in years previous. The invasion of Ukraine has raised significant barriers to moving capital between Russia and the United States. Tariffs have reshored the fabrication of artworks back to the territories in which they will be exhibited and or sold. So you're seeing here the kind of contemporary iteration and the historical reference of this meme. In the previous model, an artist's career was measured by their presence within a global network of museums and biennials. Various websites even calculate reputational ranks based on such metrics, that's a very bizarre idea that there's a leaderboard for contemporary art. But you can find more than a few of these, and they would basically create a value system, participation in an exhibition, auction houses, biennials, things like this. In this new multipolar order, artists will primarily exhibit or sell their work within one sphere and will be far less likely to appear in others. Additionally, we can observe hard laws and soft rules that set the parameters of acceptable expression within each zone. Legally enshrined decency laws in Russia, explicit state censorship in China, and private divestment in the United States. Each represent a local limit to artistic freedom. So numerous examples of this come to mind, but in the private system, very easy for American art donors to just withdraw from an exhibition they don't believe in. If you are setting up an exhibition within the territory of China, there is literally somebody from the government who comes around with a clipboard to check things off, make sure it's acceptable. And if you are exhibiting artworks in the territory of Russia, you're definitely not going to have a gay pride flag included in it. These are all kind of different forms of censorship, or let's just say limits of acceptable expression if it's not explicit censorship through divestment. But yeah, limits on individual expression. Instead of a global convergence upon a shared set of values, these developments indicate that there are growing forms of value that have become non-transferable between blocs. The aesthetic, financial, and philosophical values expressed within the institutions of each sphere are becoming more distinct and separate. So this artwork I'm showing here is called Ideologies. These are found images in niche corners of the political internet. And I've been working on this series for maybe 5, 6 years now, where I will collect a MySpace-like top 8 of flags for that year or season and kind of gather them together like a group of friends. They were first exhibited in downtown Manhattan in an empty beer hall. And I like to think of this as a kind of 21st century bizarro analog to the young Hegelians meeting up to discuss the important philosophical topics of the day, but it's the deranged attention economy version of this with all of these different niche politics. Continuing on, the great firewall of culture. When compared to 20th century Cold War divisions, today's ideological differences appear rather small. We no longer see a clash of grand narratives and political economic models. Instead, we see a growing convergence, powerful executive authority invested in an individual leader who rules over a large territory of specialized economic zones, or as Americans prefer to call them, states. That is very funny to me, maybe not to everyone else. At the same time, class has once again returned as a valid and acceptable way of understanding the world, but with significant limitations to its universal scope. Today, we see few discussions about an international proletariat and much more talk about competition between American and Chinese workers. Under multipolarity, class divisions have become bound in national collaboration. Workers and capitalists in America compete against workers and capitalists in China. Friendshoring describes the withdrawal of certain forms of production from geopolitical competitors, particularly silicon chips and green energy, and their relocation to allied or vassal states. Losing access to these essential goods now poses a steep risk to national security. As a result, tariffs and military alliances will now divide up consumer markets and cultural spheres. This new paradigm of friendshoring This new paradigm of friendshoring will shape cultural institutions and their curatorial programs. As a practical matter, artworks function as both discursive and financial objects. They are often rare and expensive to produce. Their monetary value is tied to both their physical materials as well as their cultural and historical significance. In the previous globalized model, capital and culture was allowed to freely move across national borders. But for artworks to function as discursive objects, excuse me, I'm losing my place here as I adjust. For artworks to function as discursive objects, it necessarily means that these financial assets be allowed to move across state lines with relative freedom. In this way, the multipolar model will obstruct the free flow of ideas and culture when it prevents expensive artworks from moving between zones. So, apologies for being so reductive about this, but imagine trying to move one of these enormous, like Pierre Huy artworks over different countries where you have like literal shipping containers of stuff, and it's tremendously expensive. In the near future, artists might choose to produce their works within an exhibition's local or friend-shored zone. However, it seems unlikely that competing blocks will valorize the capital investments of other spheres. American artists won't be casting bronze with Chinese fabricators anytime soon. We might see the slow emergence of art green zones, linked networks of fabricators, institutions, and auction houses nested under the respective tariff regimes and military umbrellas of the world hegemons. Not to name any particular names, I happen to know an artist who casts bronze in China, and literally the buildings are adjoined. The foundry where they make the work, and that's in the back, and the gallery is in the front. But he's going to have a very difficult time now moving that to any buyer in New York. Very tempted to say his name right now because it's a very funny story, but I'm not going to. I'm fighting the urge. This new model of geopolitics might install a curatorial firewall. Already, decency laws within Russia prevent the exhibition of certain canonical American artworks. Think anything made by Jasper Johns, for example, specifically those that include queer themes or imagery. The value of such works, discursively, aesthetically, and financially, cannot be bridged between these spheres. As more artworks reach similar legal and economic blockades, think more broadly of any kind of political dissent included in an artwork, a hemispherical cleavage will emerge in which professional accolades, cultural capital, and prices all become distinct and non-transferable. Okay, I will try to comfortably wrap all of this up here, because I know we're going a little bit over time. In the past few years, I've seen more than a few artists voluntarily self-censor or choose to withdraw their artworks from problematic contexts or from exhibitions that take place under governments. Uh, Choose to withdraw their artworks from problematic contexts or from exhibitions that take place under governments with whom they personally disagree. I worry that these principled gestures might belie a deeper lack of confidence in art's ability to communicate across spheres. I wonder if artists themselves may have lost faith in contemporary art as a form of discursive exchange. If we believe in the potential of art as discourse, it may be incumbent upon us to participate in contested spaces. Otherwise, we cede cultural institutions to our opposition and further empower our political opponents. We should not forget that within each sphere, there are individuals actively working to transform values within institutions. And because it's on my CV, I'll name some of the obvious examples here, but under the Law and Justice Party in Poland, they sacked everybody in a particular museum and replaced them with some people who had really heinous politics. Do you participate in that space, or do you just hand these institutions over to the people you disagree with? Then when you have a change of government, they restaff everybody. Similar things happening in Italy. This is the kind of argument that Americans will make for the private art system, that it is not kind of swayed by the winds of these kind of left-right parties in the case of a publicly funded museum, as is the case in Europe. Art is a unique social space. It allows for forms of cultural exchange that may be impossible or prohibited in other spheres. I'm hanging political ideologies in a government building in this last slide. This is in Ljubljana, in the Ljubljana Biennial a few years ago, which is, by the letter of the law, illegal in most countries. It is not something from which we should easily retreat or surrender. Globalization, as we have known it, may be over. Whatever comes next might be worse. Yet the project of shaping a universal society organized by human values is ever present and ongoing. I believe that art will play an integral role in this process. So thank you for indulging me with my broad provocations and unsubstantiated arguments, but hopefully I get some juices flowing about what this new art world is going to look like. And in hindsight, many of the things that we had assumed about art, which may now not actually be true, unfortunately.
Thank you, Josh. That was amazing. I'm sure that some people came to this, they're like, there's a weekly chat with an artist. I'll see what it's about. And they weren't expecting that an artist would sound or talk about things in exactly the way that you do. So Thank you for staying with us because when you work as an artist, I think in 2026, really for a long time, you're in this position of, you've come up through this world where you develop a creative practice. It means certain things to you and to people in your community. And then at some point, if you reach a certain level of success or visibility, you intersect in some way with this incomprehensible global political and economic system, which, kind of is what the infrastructure of contemporary art, kind of is. And there's something that you say in your text. So you kind of sketch this portrait of a world where, um, we had this era of globalization. There was a
Mm,
supposed convergence of values, and now we have more fracturing. And so art is not going to circulate in the same way anymore. And so, you know, although there was so much bad about the free flow of capital globally, like there was, many stories of exploitation, you know, I suppose the free flow of contemporary art was like the good reflection of that. It was like it allowed us to have these like shared kind of cultural exchanges in some way. So I guess what I'm getting at is like somewhere in your text is actually a very hopeful perspective on art, actually, and like
mm, mm.
a refusal to kind of let that dream of allowing ideas to flow and this idea of exchange, like somehow that like hope for art is still there. Can you talk a little about that? Like, what is the hope for art now? And if we contest these spaces and fight for art as exchange, you know, does that still provide like a model for like a social change and a better world? I think you said a universal society. Is that still where we're regrouping, or is that not?
Yeah, I suppose that I'm kind of lumping these things together in the text in a way to kind of provoke the art world's reflection on um, the reach of global finance at the same time, because conceivably you could place a financial cap on the value of any artwork, right? Like, I mean, I think it's impossible to get around the fact that artworks are scarce, they're expensive to produce, the historical ones are really scarce. Like, they're going to be expensive in some way. But then conceivably having a limit to how expensive that could be, uh, that's a feasible piece of legislation that there should be no, artwork made by a human being that is worth $100 million, for example. So you don't just have this completely deregulated flow of assets. Uh, and I think what I'm trying to do by pairing these things is also the way in which the kind of globalization of the art world allowed for the rhetorical permission for the finance to happen also. Um, and so that these things were kind of you always find something tangled with it with its opposite in that it is doing both a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. And so I think what I kind of botched my way through in the beginning of it, which is kind of these topics are, too big to really crack open in such a short time, but that the kind of multipolar vision of some of these artworks are from civilizations that are drawing on thousands of years of history. In some cases, they are much older than Europe. They are orders of magnitude older than the United States. And so the types of things that are kind of championed by that order are much more traditional or traditionalistic in their artistic production. And so I think there was a kind of pairing of this, in hindsight, very kind of American interpretation of individual entrepreneurial innovative genius like forking conservative decisions and being blocked by institutions that was realized with the internet, and that this would also kind of like bring about the global society and kind of release the entrepreneurial spirits in the neoliberal vision. And instead it has been countered by this like just absurdly irrational, traditional, kind of orthodox, unreformed by modernity type of often religious or traditional values. So yeah, it's a very tough position to be. Like what I guess the American assumptions are no longer kind of hegemonic or underpinning other people's decisions, and these things are unfortunately the rubber meets the road when they become material or kinetic conflicts. The Greenland thing is really just it's doing a number on me this week.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, but I do end it with that hope, which is that I don't think that you can abandon. I think actually like the hazard is that if you abandon the universalisms, then you have like even lost track of the good part of it. The question is how do you then like politically apply that philosophy? But you shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
All right. Hey, Michael, hey, can we got some questions in the chat.
yeah.
Should I
Go for
start?
it.
We'll start to, I also have so many questions, but I won't jump in. Marcus, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, yeah, I kind of like wrote prose. I could summarize it in a more conversational way. Um,
Sure.
uh, Jo- Great conversation. I'm like genuinely, I'm kind of a fan of yours, but I hadn't read this essay. I have to say, there's many ways where we disagree. I start off by just being like slow clap, fabulous framing of everything. Now, what I wanted to get into is talk about something kind of dirty. Web3 stuff, looking back at what we basically kind of have a beginning and an end to that movement. And I think I can kind of observe that by the end of it, artists primarily kind of dumped on the NFTs got gross, and we all said that's not cool. My God, what were we even thinking? There were a
Hmm.
couple of
Hmm.
us that were kind of straddling there, being like, hold up, there's some distribution mechanics here we could look at. And we're always, of course, Holly and I'm sorry, what's Holly's husband's name?
Matt Dryhurst.
Yeah, yes, yeah, good examples of people being like, hey, take a look, there's something going on. So my question here, as we pursue pluralism, or perhaps just anticipate pluralism and react to it, I think artists have done a lot of critiquing of the market, perhaps more than critiquing of institutions. They kind of like look for institutional access, and it's safer to critique markets because we're railing against the plutocrats. So the question is, in your framework, do you foresee, or would you personally like prescribe a slightly shifted, more optimistic take towards something like the creation of new markets? Like, in other words, I mean, is there like a room for more pro-market mechanisms here to get to these regional pluralistic exchanges?
Yeah, the crypto stuff is tremendously important. And I feel like I'm glad that you're keeping that flame alive because when these things do come back in a very real way, it'll be like, well, where did that come from? And there is a kind of teleological conflict that's happening here between the reassertion of states and literally tariffs preventing the flow of capital versus an infrastructurally stateless capital that cannot be constrained to the extent where I mean, unless you are going to literally put people in prison within the territory of your state because they hold crypto, like these things are going to come into conflict somewhere because the states need to be able to claw back the value to provision themselves, to raise an army, to pave their streets, and feed a workforce, and all of this kind of stuff. So yeah, it's a big deal in the multipolar art world. I'm gonna try and stay on topic for this because it's like so big, but I think the critique of institutions. I think that was woke. I think that was the kind of response from the institutions that had been brewing for several decades of like people who had been excluded from the canon and shouldn't have. And then once all of the gates were open, the institutions often saw themselves as like, well, how do we sort this overwhelming production of culture? And so one thing that they could clearly do was to kind of revise the portions of their own canon and collections that had unjustly excluded people. But then the problem is like the market critiqued itself for the NFTs with through the financialization. And yeah, the problem was like if you, I promise I'm going to land this somewhere, but promise was that when you had all of these mechanisms in place that would allow the kind of rampant speculation, of course it was a race to the bottom. But if you, tracing all these things back, there is a less volatile price action around certain cultural goods that the people who are the philosophical architects behind the network states see as being the organizational method behind which people will gather. So that sounds insanely abstract, what I just said, but
You're
to the
making
degree
sense to
that we
me. I'm following.
Okay, well,
You
I
landed
feel like
it.
we're
I mean,
speaking
it's
Greek to a lot of people who haven't heard these things before, but there's going to be some gathering mechanism, which is a cultural good or a loose philosophical set of values, a vibe, in a legal sense, a constitution, that people will be, subscribed to one way of viewing the world and not another. And that those things could, as crypto people love to talk, in the 100-year scope, become another type of organizing principle for state-like structures that are non-contiguous. And the way that, I mean, that is, I think, the most interesting kind of zoomed out conflict of our times, the reassertion of a multipolar world order or states, and then a ballooning, seemingly unstoppable trend line of stateless capital that continues to grow, that could potentially become a rival structure within the 21st century. Um, Great, great question to pull out of the chat. Actually, it's a whole other podcast. But
Oh my gosh.
yeah.
Yeah. So Callie had a question. She wants me to ask for her. So I'm going to completely just remix and bastardize it to my own ends. One of the things she's talking about is like institutions, and she's talking about accessibility. But I think I'd love to talk about like legibility. So it's like, okay, so you have these biennials popping up in all these different places, and obviously there's audiences for them. Like, where are these political messages like legible to these audiences? Like, who is this art for? Like, who is it supposed to connect with? Like, who's supposed to be able to read it?
It depends where you're looking. A lot of them, the context of the 90s are talking about post-colonial theory and kind of
Mhm.
recentering the art world. So they will include in their exhibitions the kind of regional or indigenous artists in the center and the Western artists on the periphery. You'll see
Yeah.
things like that. Um, but I think as with many things in the art world, there is the kind of explicit or manifest content, and then there's the latent content where, I studied art and I participated in art and I learned, you know, um, Adorno and the Frankfurt School and all of this kind of like Marxist theory and post-Marxism and Baudrillard and whatever. And then you find yourself in the art world and it is just deregulated anarcho-capitalism that's like a Bible written by Friedrich Hayek. And so these both of these things are happening at the same time. And the art world is like it's so impenetrable that it can contain that incredible difference. So there is often, institutions are made up of people. This is the great kind of irony is that there are people who are advancing a certain agenda and others who are advancing a different one. Um, and so I think I'm summarizing some of the conversation that I had with Quinn, but there was in the kind of letter of the press release in many of these cases of biennialization, um, they were kind of speaking against colonialism, which was kind of the previous wave of globalization, right? But at the same time as they're rhetorically speaking against it, they are ushering in this new wave through global financial institutions that are like, kind of allowing finance to creep rather than the colonial military. So, which way is the value being extracted, either by force or by economic coercion? Um,
Mm.
yeah, yeah, but they're both bundled in together, strangely enough.
I
Yeah.
think it's
No,
also interesting, Josh, like it's not just like explicit propaganda, the kinds of political messaging. It's not exactly messaging always like an explicit message to the world. Oftentimes there's an institution that's trying to reflect a patron's interests back to the patron,
Mm,
mm,
provide the patron a sense of their own place in the world. Um, and I feel like there's that kind of dynamic. So what's actually happening is more like yeah, like an unconscious content that you're trying to be like, why is this happening? Like
mm.
I'm an artist, I showed up in this weird place, I'm being asked to do this thing. Why is this happening? And it does get it's not like a pamphlet for the world that they can read and understand. It's something that's like happening on a more social and psychological level as well, but organized around like the people that have the power to make that happen, you know? It's like a patronage system
Yeah.
um, that wants to satisfy itself.
No,
You
Josh,
know?
but it's interesting to me because like I also went to like I had my studied my BA and my BFA and did all the art history and read Hegel and Kant and all that stuff. But like I wonder, it's like most like I go to Art Basel Miami, okay, and like the people who are buying this stuff, the people who are buying a Koons or a Daniel Arsham, like. They're looking, to me, it's like I don't hear them talking about it in those terms, like maybe, even if they're buying a Shirin Nishad or a Walid Rod, like they seem to be purchasing like things that are basically like memes to identity and
Mhm.
significations of like wealth and
Right.
like things that trans and that like and I know there are all these different art worlds, but I'm just trying to sort of like position what I know of an art world that operates sort of like monetarily and aesthetically versus one that like operates politically and is politically, and like also just knowing that a lot of this political stuff to a lot of these people, like even the very, very wealthy, is
Mhm.
completely illegible.
But I
Right.
think
Right.
even in your question, Josh, it's like you're the patron. You have
Right.
6 regional artists in your collection, and your biennial puts those people in conversation with Lawrence Weiner. So it increases the status of what you've done. So already like there's already an answer in your question of,
Yeah.
of how this, kind of plays out, which is by bringing these things into conversation, the patron has shown that their place as a regional collector is on a world stage and is important. Um, I mean, it's
One
just
one
one
thing to
dynamic.
One thing to slightly complicate this is there's an article, I think it was last year by Annie Armstrong in ArtNet News called Red Chip Art, which
Yeah.
talks
Yeah.
about a type of crypto is in there, like Banksy is in there and cause, and it's kind of like things that are maybe not in the kind of highest echelons of cultural institutions, but are viable financial assets, have a lot of new money to collectors. And I think one of the things that you saw with crypto, I wrote a very unpopular article about this, a few years ago now, but like the degree to which crypto made all of these new elites in such a rapid few years, and they didn't pass through the usual vetting institutions, that I think there was a way in which legitimacy through all of these agonistic forces you're describing, Michael, where you could have the Marxist theorists at the table. I'm thinking of a literal person here, a Marxist art critic at the after party table with the dealer, with the billionaire collector, and somehow all of those forces were kind of working to further their own interests that would generally put this thing in a very uncomfortable but steady alignment. And then the speed at which we make these new elites has outpaced the rate at which we can build vetting institutions. And so the elites have begun to behave more kind of reckless. And so you don't get like the Carnegies who are building libraries and these kind of like benevolent public infrastructure projects. And so yeah, it starts to take on a different shape, and maybe the legitimacy of and eventually tears away. I mean, we're kind of this is at least the privilege of the art world is that you can talk in these sweeping kind of speculative senses, but it's at least becoming, I think, more tenuous. Whereas before there was like artists were relatively, I think, resigned to this is the way that things are, and these people control the purse strings, and there is no alternative. And so I will find a way to work within this system, and I can, have a lower middle class precarious life. And then the kind of the ladder was pulled up away from those people. So it seems very kind of precarious and untenable, more so now.
All right, Sarah, you have a question. You want to ask it?
Sure, yeah. So, I was just kind of curious about like the like sort of conclusion at the end about like artists losing faith in like art as a form of discursive exchange. Because I think what I see a lot with like the artists that I know and things like that is that like what people are worried about is not so much like what they're able to communicate in their art, but like the way that that gets mediated and sort of transformed as it goes outside of like the actual context where the art is being shown. So like
Mhm.
there are only so many people who will see like, okay, this is the actual piece, and a lot more people who will think like, oh, this person chose to show art in this particular space and they are bad for this reason, or they should not be kind of like taken seriously as an artist. So I guess I'm kind of curious, like how you see like the way that people should approach either making art or showing art in these contexts when there is that kind of complicating layer of like how many people like not experience it in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it does. This is so I'm now financially untethered to the art world. Um, there is a form of social and cultural capital that artists in competition for scarce spaces and exhibitions can levy against each other by legislating the morality of other people's decisions to show in complicated contexts. And so basically, the people who are excluded from these exhibitions will level moral critiques against the people who are invited to participate in them, either because the context is bad, or the political environment in the country is bad, or the donor is bad, or the building isn't ADA accessible, or whatever it happens to be. The competition between the artist's elite aspirations cause them to use these moral weapons against each other. And so I think you basically kind of talk yourself into a corner in which artists who live in a capitalist society in which they do not have access to the necessary goods for survival, other through selling their labor on the market, they have to somehow simultaneously self-fund themselves without having the resources, but also not show in institutions and prevent contrary ideas. You have to keep in mind that the people who work in these politically complicated situations, they oppose what's happening on the ground. They oppose what the institution is doing. They oppose the law. And part of what they hope to do through showing that art is to garner enough cultural support to change their institutions and their nations. And artists are basically just so goddamn selfish that they will ruthlessly attack each other on these moral grounds that kind of walk you back into a position of not being able to do anything because everything is like tainted in some small way. Um, You'll see this in big biennial exhibitions, right? It's like this happens every time in the US. You also see it in small, like apartment galleries. So it really has to do with the particular class position of artists. And as the class position of artists has become more precarious, their moral attacks on each other have become even more vicious. They got more cutthroat as a result, particularly in the context of like these intergenerational conflicts where people could get curators fired and then the younger people could ascend within the institution. So, yeah, I guess that's the like this is like suicide to talk about within the context of the art world, but I went bankrupt doing that job many years ago, so I can speak freely about it now. Yeah, the one thing that is more durable is like if you do actually have a contribution to make, but it can be, you know, extremely painful, if not like bankrupting to get there. Yeah, I don't think that you should shy away from those things. But you also have to like you have to be honest with yourself in a way that's really difficult of whether, you know, what is your utility in this exhibition? And if it's for like the personal amusement of let's say like a sovereign or all sorts of examples, you're probably not changing the world or doing discourse through that. But if you are doing the discourse, then it is incumbent upon you to actually participate because um, yeah, that's the point of what we're doing here. So um, I'll leave it at that. Yeah, it's a great topic though. It's a really great topic.
Cool.
Yeah, I
Thank you
mean,
so much.
the famous exhibition When Attitudes Become Form, Harold Zamen's conceptual art show, sponsored by Philip Morris. The documentation is
Mm,
just incredible photos of artists smoking cigarettes. They showed up in their hotel rooms and they had free
wow.
cigarettes. And it's sort of like this is an old story of the artist doing double duty. And it's I think this kind of education or conversation so that you go into it and understanding what's happening is really helpful because then
Yeah.
you can make a conscious decision and feel like you're, able to build from there. Jack has a question. What do you want to do next, Josh? We have a few minutes.
Oh, I think Jarrell had
Hey,
I,
Jack.
I think we have time for one more. Or, okay, which one do you want to do? Jack or
Let's
okay.
let's grab a question from Jack. We've had a ongoing
All
dialogue
right,
for
Jack,
like
you got it.
5 years now. No one knows better than Jack.
Jack. All right, this
Yeah.
might be the last question, so have at it.
So it was really, really great conversation. It's really nice to hear all these things we've been talking about for so long, kind of like summed up into this really nice presentation. Yeah. So my question is, do you think with this multipolarization of the art world, we're going to see less of these massive scale biennales? Just thinking about the kind of mess that Documented turned into, and then the kind of process of the next document is already starting to kind of implode. Do you think we're going to see less of these massive scale events and maybe a rise of these smaller, like regional, more like balkanized, like little art fairs and kind of, catering to smaller niche political ideals? That is my question.
Hmm. Yeah, Documenta, man, it is very difficult. In some ways, the Venice Biennial is kind of like the Olympics of the art world, where everybody shows up to like represent their state, and you see them try their skills and compete in some way. Literally, somebody wins, right? There's like a there's a prize. Documenta is under fire for so many different things, but it's like the biggest public art institution. I think it's $50 million, and it's also legacy of Germany's way of kind of if people aren't familiar, this is a post-World War II institutions, the biggest, I think the biggest publicly funded art exhibition, maybe just the biggest art exhibition in the world. But it was Germany's way of kind of reintroducing themselves to enlightened liberal society after the horrors of World War II. And so the degree to which that really means something to the German state, I think, is very strong. But God forbid, I don't know, AfD gets empowered. Do they just sack Documenta and call it over? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's very complicated. I would expect the only kind of limitation on this more balkanized regional thing is that the access to capital is then constrained, you know? So maybe you get like one of these goofy San Francisco like 6 foot tall sculptures of like a Greek soldier type bullshit that they post on Twitter, and you get like a more kind of humble biennial in like Indonesia or Thailand or things like that. But yeah, I don't think we're having like a kind of World's Fair in competing different countries where
Mm.
that capital, like social capital and financial, is accumulated in one place, so they only have themselves to show off to. You don't need to compete with the other one, whereas before you could kind of move that reputation between these different blocks. But if you can't, you sign into one server, you don't have all your reputation stats anymore in
So
the video game analogy.
Mm.
all right, guys, I think we're at time. So Michael, do you want to say a few words? And then Joshua, you want to sign us off and tell us how people can stay in contact with you, how we can continue the conversation. So Michael, you start and then hand it off to Joshua. And
I'm just going to say thank you, Joshua. That was awesome. Thanks for all for coming. Make sure to trust your guts out there. Next week we have Mitchell Chan. Mitchell Chan will be joining us Friday at 2. Very excited. And yeah, thank you, Josh.
yeah, I also thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Joshua.
Oh,
Thank you, Michael.
those of you in New York, we have an event Wednesday at Earth. Come by. Very weird event. It'll be awesome.
All right. And Joshua, how can
Cool.
people like support you, stay in contact with you?
Find me probably YouTube Doomscroll podcast, Joshua Citarella on Substack. It's my name on all the different platforms. Yeah, lovely to talk. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Michael. This was a blast.
All
Yeah, and
right,
thanks everybody for
amazing.
coming.
All right, thanks everybody. This was like a super interesting conversation to bring us into the weekend. Hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. I hope to see you all next week. Thanks so much, Joshua. Thanks, Michael. We'll hopefully keep the conversation going. See y'all. Thank you.
All right,
Bye.
thanks, gang.
Bye.
Bye.